So, well, let's start another Atlantic and Arctic Lighthouse Weekly Hour, this time with the project MarineSABRES. And MarineSABRES is a very interesting project that's looking for approach for biodiversity, resilience, and ecosystem sustainability. MarineSABRES is a EU-funded research project that brought together 21 research partners to restore marine biodiversity and support a sustainable blue economy by increasing the uptake of ecosystem-based management in Europe. Very importantly, they have 3 research sites, one in the Tuscan Archipelago, focused on tourism and seagrass conservation, another one in Macaronesia, focused on conservation, restoration, and ecotourism, and the third one is in the Arctic Northeast Atlantic, focused on climate change and commercial fisheries. This afternoon, we will have Catherine Chambers and Gemma Smith. They will present the research site at the Arctic Northeast and Atlantic. And I will pass now the floor to Valerie. She will introduce the speakers, and then after the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. Please write at the Q&A box your questions, not the chat, please. And if you want to intervene at the very end and you want to talk to the speakers, please raise your hand. So, Valerie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jose, and welcome everyone to our audience, both those here on Zoom and also on YouTube and through our other channels. We're really excited about today's presentation on MarineSABRES project. As Jose highlighted, there's 21 researchers or partners, I should say, involved in this project. I think what I really want to highlight too is that more and more we are discovering how important healthy and productive seas are and how crucial they are for our human well-being, and how they provide essential ecosystem services and support economic sustainability. So I'm going to start. So today's presentation starts with Dr. Catherine Chambers, and then we'll go to Gemma Smith, and then back to Dr. Catherine Chambers. Dr. Chambers is a senior scientist at the Stefansson Arctic Institute and research manager at the University Center, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Catherine, of the Westfjords in Ísafjörður, Iceland. Her specialties focus on human dimensions of fisheries, cultural heritage, ocean governance, human relationships with marine resources, changing coastal communities, fishers' knowledge, ocean literacy, and small-scale fisheries. Recent research involves intergenerational justice in small-scale fishers and climate change mitigation in fishers-dependent communities. Professional appointments include chair of the Social and Human Working Group of the International Arctic Science Committee and vice chair of the University of the Arctic Thematic Network on Ocean Food Systems. Catherine serves on the Icelandic Ministry for the Environment and Natural Resources Task Force on Arctic Affairs and the Icelandic Ministry of Fisheries and Agriculture Strategic Policy Formation Working Group. Oh my God, that's a mouthful. And then we have Gemma Smith, who is currently a PhD student studying systems science, and also has an MSc in Environmental Change and Management and a Bachelor of Law. Her foundations are in interdisciplinary research interests in marine, coastal, and estuarine management. She is currently researching the role of socio-ecological systems within complex adaptive management regarding marine quality assessment, spatial planning, and informant management responses. So we're in for a real treat in today's conversation. So I hand it over to Catherine to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie and Jose. What wonderful introductions. And I think that means I can even go a little faster in my beginning portions here where I'm explaining the project. So Gemma, would you like to bring up the slides for us? Thank you. And again, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. Gemma and I are really excited to tell you about this project and really happy to see all the names and affiliations and folks tuning in both here on Zoom and also on YouTube. So let's go to the next slide, please, Gemma. So today we've structured the talk into three sections. I'll overview the basic idea of the MarineSABRES project. By the way, we say Sabres and Sabres, and I think maybe we decided it was Sabres, but I still kind of mixed between the two. So you're welcome to do the same as well. Then we'll go a little bit more in depth into the theory and background, the sort of academic underpinnings of the social ecological system theory, and what it means to create a simple social ecological system. So Gemma will take care of that. And then I'll go into the details specifically on our Arctic demonstration area using these theoretical underpinnings and show you a bit of the work that we've been doing. It's very much in the preliminary finding stages, but I'm excited to show you what we've learned so far. And then we'll open it up for questions. Next slide. So MarineSABRES stands for Systems Approaches for Biodiversity, Resilience, and Ecosystem Sustainability. And the overall aim of this EU Horizon project is to conserve and protect biodiversity by integrating sustainable ecosystems and a resilient blue economy. But how exactly do we do that? We're going to bring stakeholders together from government, policy, business, coastal management, also with marine scientists, and the major goal is to co-design. So again, working all together to design a simple social ecological system. And this is used to improve uptake of ecosystem-based management. So these are things we know we need to do, ecosystem-based management. There's a lot of theory behind that. And we think that this theories of the social ecological system is one really good way to tackle ecosystem-based management in marine and coastal areas. And we want to strengthen interventions and measures for the protection and conservation of coastal and marine areas, their biodiversity, and their ecosystem services. Next slide. So we have three phases of the project. Phase one is the specification and development of a simple social ecological system. So how do we even make one of these? Phase two is the application, testing, and demonstration of the system. And phase three is the refinement of the simple social ecological system. And there's a little bit more information here on sort of the work package design, but basically what I want you to see here is that at the very sort of center of the whole project is this idea of the multi-actor approach. So really from the beginning, we've been co-designing and co-producing knowledge with our stakeholders with these overarching ideas of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and conservation protection in mind. Next slide. So as was wonderfully introduced in the beginning, I'll cover again here. So we have 22 partners from 11 countries. The project, it's a 4-year project, European project, and it is coordinated by the University College Cork. So shout out to the amazing people there at the Mare Center who are making sure that we're all in line with this very big and very ambitious project. So we have these 3 demonstration areas. You can think of them as case studies, but the wording is demonstration area or DA. That's in the Tuscan Archipelago, the thing that I'll tell you about today, which is the Arctic Northeast Atlantic, and then Macaronesia. And so what we want to do is create the ideas of these social ecological systems within these DAs, and then also try to learn what we can compare in between and across the DAs for sort of an overarching sort of idea of how we use these social ecological systems to achieve ecosystem-based management. Next slide. Yes, okay, this is just a repeat of what we already talked about, so we'll continue on there. And now I'm so lucky and happy to have Gemma cover the theory behind this, because as you, I guess, probably all know from one of these big projects, we're all specialists and have a specialty in a specific area. And it's so wonderful to have the work package that Gemma is part of really teaching us, well, how do we do this? I consider myself a practitioner and very much an applied social scientist. And it's so fun to get into the theories of what a social ecological system is and what it means to create one. So I'll give it over to Gemma now.
Thanks ever so much, Catherine. So I'm going to be speaking a bit about the underlying theory and concepts of the simple social ecological model that we've created. So this is very much the academic and on paper side of it, whereas Kat's going to speak a bit more later about how it's been applied. So just first to look at what a simple social ecological system is. So within this approach of creating a simple view of a system, we had a lot of discussions around what do we mean by simple? Do we mean reducing it and ignoring parts of the system so we can manage it? Do we embrace the complexity and try and make a focus on what we're looking at so that we can make better informed decisions? So with regards to the word simple, we really meant this in a way of simple to use. So we've got quite a detailed guidance document as an output of the project, and then reducing this complexity to make it easier to make these better informed decisions. So with the social and ecological elements, we look at both the human and natural aspects within the system. So these human aspects can range from fishing to tourism to policies, which differ quite a lot from the natural aspects. So these marine processes and functionings, the habitats, the ecosystem services. And then when we look at a system, this has lots of different definitions across lots of different disciplines. Although we define this as a scope of focus where the different aspects interact. So whether this be a particular ecosystem, any specific area, at the level of member states, if we're looking at EU directives and so on. So altogether, this creates our simple social ecological system. So throughout Work Package 3, we underwent a very rigorous literature review where we reviewed lots of social ecological system frameworks to see how these approaches have been undertaken and what elements they encompass. So this was done through a SWOT analysis, as well as looking at desirable characteristics that align with ecosystem-based management goals. So really then principles around the ecosystem approach. The framework that came out on top was the integrated systems analysis, although we don't want to say everything's perfect because we did do a SWOT analysis and we looked to supplement this framework where there were weaknesses and threats and also opportunities to use other foundational social ecological system frameworks and tools from the systems discipline in approaching this. So the integrated systems analysis is a quite encompassing framework, although it was a very conceptual model that we needed to operationalize throughout this project. So at the heart of this framework is the DAPSI underpinning framework. This is a problem structuring method to help us organize these different social and ecological elements with our system. So we look at the drivers, so why we're using the marine environment, how we're using it, the activities, the pressures that this can cause on ecosystem services and marine processing function, so these state changes, and the impacts that this has on our welfare. And to do this, we have these three parts. So part A, which is identifying and setting our priorities. We have part B, which is getting the information, and part C, which is using the information. So when we operationalize this, as you can see, the DAPSI framework goes anti-clockwise as a causal linkage framework. However, we chose to approach this in a clockwise manner, as when identifying issues and setting priorities. These impacts on welfare are things that directly relate to us and our stakeholders. So the goods and benefits that we receive from the marine environment that are impacted. And then we go through this in a backwards way, so from the impacts on welfare to the state change to the pressures. We get information on the various socio-economic, ecological and social ecological elements. And then we hopefully use all this information to inform upon our decisions and action planning to make it better. And this process is all encompassed within our process and information management system. So this is very much foundations of good management. So looking at the various resource and delivery. So what are we aiming to do? How are we going to do that? The quality assurance surrounding different data types. So not only are we dealing with quantitative and very natural science data, we are also dealing with data from the social sciences and speaking to stakeholders, which is not always as replicable and as clean as other procedures. And we also look at the governance. So what rules are in place for this system? Who implements these rules? Who are we involved in this conversation? And then also this is a circular. It's in a cycle as a process. So we look at the feedback loop and the achievement. So if we've set out what have we set out to do and have we achieved this? What can we do better next time? What do we know more to inform us moving forward? So this PIM system is very much a foundational part of the process. As I mentioned with Simple, every management action may not be able to afford an expert systems dynamicist to do the most wonderful and beautiful analysis of a very complex system. However, in designing a simple SES, we want these tools to be accessible and usable by managers. So this PIM system really helps set these foundations for a credible and reliable process, so we can see how we have good data provenance and management, who we've involved in this conversation with the stakeholders in taking a critical approach. And there's overall project and resource management to guide our process and ensure that we can hit the goals or learn more about our system as we've designed to. So the DAPSI worm, this was at the center of our framework. This is a problem structuring method which has been developed specifically for the marine environment. It acknowledges that those principles of ecosystem-based management that we need things from the ocean and we do things to the ocean to get it, and that has impacts there, but it also has impacts on us, both positive and negative. So this really helps us structure those various social and ecological elements within that environment. So these drivers are our basic human needs. So the reason why we're conducting activities within the marine environment, so whether that be for subsistence, so we need to eat and this provides nutrition. This could be for livelihood or sense of belonging. So these all warrant various activities within the marine environment. Some examples of these activities could be economic and employment. It could be to do with tourism and fishing, fishing efforts. And all these things can cause various pressures, such as pollution or the transport of invasive species, which then will have an impact on the various elements within the ecosystem. So causing a state change. These state changes can be to the final outcomes of the system which we use. So maybe the fish that we use to eat, or it can also be on the marine processing function within the system. So these secondary services such as hydrological conditions, habitats where the fish live that we need, which then has an impact on our goods and benefits and impacts on our welfare. So this problem structuring method has a look at within the system of focus, but it can also help us acknowledge these external pressures that may be influencing our system. So things such as climate change, that would be part of the exogenic unmanaged pressures. But if we acknowledge that, we can take it into account when designing our management responses. So we use some tools from the systems discipline in operationalizing this integrated systems analysis. One of these was the behavior over time graphs. So very similar to in the natural sciences, you can have time series where on one axis is how the element's behaving and on the other axis is over time. This can help us connect past observed behaviours with future behaviour in a way that offers insight into underlying causal structures of individual elements. So throughout this problem structuring method of the DAPSI worm, we can use indicators as proxy measures to see how the various elements are acting individually using behaviour over time graphs. But then we can also use our expert judgment to see how the elements are acting together within the system, so as a whole, rather than looking at those connections between. So these tools, such as adjacency matrices, have been included within the approach. So we assign either a positive or a negative polarity to the connections and causalities between indicators. So a positive one would mean that both indicators are moving in the same direction. So an example of this may be that there's more fish within an area, so then the fishing efforts go up. So both of those things are moving in the same direction. Whereas, say, if fishing efforts go up and fish stocks go down, they'd be moving the opposite, so then that would be a negative polarity. And we can also assign a sensitivity of this, so whether this be strong, medium, or weak, positive or negative polarities, because this is in efforts to create a causal loop diagram. So a causal loop diagram is a qualitative modelling tool from the systems discipline. It helps us analyse how a system behaves as a whole. So rather than measuring all the individual elements, we do that and then we take the next step of looking at how they interact together as a system and what outcomes can emerge from that. This can allow us to conduct loop analysis and identify leverage points. So I'll explain this through an example. I usually find it easy to understand that way. So here's a causal loop diagram for research and development in knowledge of marine sciences. So if we can see down here, we have industrial activity. Well, this is increasing, and so is social awareness. So this creates a positive feedback loop because they're both increasing. If this was really positive for our system, we could design response measures to strengthen this loop, as this is having a positive impact throughout our system, as we can see that as in social awareness increases, so does strategic vision, so does quality of decisions. And this may guide us to making better informed decisions on how to influence our system to achieve the goals that we've set out. The same principle applies for negative feedback loops. So a negative feedback loop may be where you have one element increasing and one element decreasing at different sensitivities. So this may be an unsustainable feedback loop, which is a leverage point within your system, and one of your response measures may be that you need to break this loop or weaken it. And then also leverage points relate to highly connected elements. So as we can see from industrial activity again, we have 3 connections coming out of it. So this may be considered a highly connected element within our system. So if we instigate change here, we know that it influences the behaviour of the whole system also. So just a quick overview of the ISA analysis, as that was a very quick whistle-stop tour of the approach. We have the PIMS system, which is the overall management system that helps us account for good data provenance and the process of the undertaking the analysis. We have the DAPSI worm framework as this underlying problem structuring method to help us identify the various social and ecological elements and their causal structures. We use tools such as behaviour over time graphs and causal loop diagrams to complement a data-driven approach in making these conclusions and also communicating these with our stakeholders. And this is intended as a learning action process, so to promote continuous and meaningful learning. So, for example, if your analysis and approach was hindered by poor data, by acknowledging this, a future management response could be that, okay, we need more information on this, and it can warrant for further inquiry. So that's just a quick overview and operationalized. Here's a schematic. So we structure our issue. We undertake this process using different tools and looking at the various relationships between the social and ecological elements to see how our system acts as a whole. And we take accountability for this in our processes in undertaking this. So as a nice quote here, just to finish off on the theory, is that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, as if we make a very simple model of such a complex marine environment, we may be disregarding very important aspects of our system to consider when making our management decisions. So I'll hand you back over to Catherine now to show you how this has been applied practically within the Arctic.
Thank you so much, Gemma. We'll continue on here just with a quick note. So the partners that are specifically involved in this Arctic demonstration area, besides myself at the Stefansson Arctic Institute in Iceland, there's also World Wildlife Fund in Greenland, Sjókoven, which is a research institute in the Faroe Islands, and the Marine and Freshwater Research Institute of Iceland, and then also Aalborg University in Denmark, whose logo is not showing up there. So those are sort of the core group that's working with us on this, this demonstration area. Can continue. Gemma? Yes. So again, yeah, we're focused on the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, and these are the pelagic fisheries is what we're looking at, and that would be the Northeast Atlantic mackerel, blue whiting, and herring. Now, of course, in these fisheries, there's other countries involved, and that was actually one challenge for us from the very beginning, was do we involve every single nation and stakeholder, or does it already become so big? And I think that that's what's been really fun for us, is to think about this as a social ecological system. We know a lot actually about the ecology side of things, not everything, but this is not a data poor area of the world. And also in terms of social and economic data, we have some data available. So we thought, well, to not make it so big, it's good if we focus in on for now just these three nations, and I'll explain a little bit more of the details about why we chose these three areas. But the basic thing that you need to know is that for all of these nations, the fisheries in general and pelagic fisheries as well are an important economic sector for both capture, processing, marketing, and employment. And that these fisheries in particular, the pelagic fisheries, there's a high interconnection between the fisheries, and that the companies are vertically integrated both within countries, and then also there's a lot of connection between countries. So we thought, again, this would be a really interesting sort of case study to use social ecological system analysis, because a lot of the time what you end up studying are sort of place-based fisheries. And we wanted to challenge that and say, well, these are fisheries happening in one particular place, out in the ocean, but there's many nations that are sort of, involved in the fishery with different cultural and economic backgrounds, social backgrounds. So how do we build a simple social ecological system that has sort of many different social parts to it? So I'll show you a little bit of what we've been doing with that. Next slide, Gemma. So again, the major sort of like idea behind this is that these are widely distributed stocks. There are many nations involved, many companies, and these stocks cross many EEZs boundaries as well as high seas areas. So it's considered a straddling and transboundary stock. Already encoded in that is the idea that, okay, there's there's going to probably be some management issues when we're trying to share a straddling stock. Next slide. And what's interesting with especially the mackerel, I think is the one that probably most people have heard the most about in the news, but blue whiting and herring as well. With these wide distribution areas, there's been a lot of changes recently in basically where the fisheries take place and where the fish are. We continue. So here's, for example, the mackerel. In the late 70s, you can see the difference between the spawning, overwintering, and feeding areas, and how that's changing just along the coast in, we'd say, just about 20 years. Continue on. And here's sort of similar to that, so where the fisheries are taking place. So especially if we look at 2018 Q3, you can see there's a lot of red sort of in between Iceland and Greenland, whereas in just 2 years later, the 2020 catch is much more moving towards the east. And so when you have these straddling stocks and the fish themselves are moving around, you have, you know, different groups of different nations and different stakeholders who are trying to access these stocks. Continue, please, Gemma. So here's a general overview of the three countries. Iceland and the Faroes have been the major sort of players in the blue whiting, herring, and mackerel catch. But in recent years, Greenland has also been a sort of up-and-coming player. We thought this is also very interesting in terms of building a social ecological system, because you have sort of like competition and also a lot of cooperation between these three countries. And they have differing sort of histories and relationships with these particular fisheries. If we continue. So here's, for example, the blue whiting fishery. What we want you to know here with all three of these fisheries, but I just wanted to show the graph. You can see the catch over time between the three countries, which I showed previously. And then if you have the black line, which is the total catch in millions of tons, you can see that sort of regularly, systematically, the catch between the three countries exceeds the advice given by the scientist. In many cases, this is upwards of 20% for the blue whiting. We continue on. Yep. And then the same story for mackerel. You see the total catch, which is, I don't want to say drastically above, but I think many biologists might say drastically above the scientific advice that's given. Continue on, Gemma. That was in some cases 40% above what the scientific advice is for the catch. And same thing for the herring, in many cases 20%. So basically what we have here is a systematic overfishing. And it really rests in the fact that all three nations, because the fish are in the waters, the territorial waters, all three nations claim the right to fish these different species. Continue. So as I said earlier, what's also interesting about this case study is that we do have a lot of sort of ecological and scientific data, and it's not that there's not a lack of information. So we have, for example, the ICES Integrated Ecosystem Assessment of the Norwegian Sea. And again, just to remind you that this is the major feeding area for all three stocks. And this, the ICES group produces this ecosystem overview. So I've taken, no, I haven't actually. These are my friends and colleagues at the Icelandic Marine Research Institute who have put together these slides. So all thanks go to them, by the way. So the terms of reference from ICES, for example, is that they should perform an integrated assessment of the pelagic ecosystem and develop a framework for identifying important signals for management, that they should annually review and revise the ecosystem status and summary to report the trends and recent changes, and that there are all formalized stakeholder interactions between Faroes, Iceland, and Norway. So there are people working together on this. if we continue on. And then there's also a lot of thought of the different both ecosystem overview and also the human activity pressures and states. So this is just to show that there is work being done and some general knowledge on, for example, contaminating compounds, underwater noise, abrasion, what might be causing and what are the pressures of these spatial shifts in the feeding and spawning grounds, and then also the states, so the habitat, food web, benthos, other fish, seabirds, and also marine mammals. So these things are in progress. We continue on. There's a very good indication that the ocean climate has a lot to do with the shifts that are observed. If we continue on, there's also changes in primary production that have been documented. Next slide. In the zooplankton, continue on. And so basically we have a little bit of this information that points to the impact of climate change and ecosystem changes on these three important fisheries stocks. So here we've mapped out, we know in general, sustainable fisheries has both environmental and social responsibility as well as the fiscal sort of responsibility, this triple bottom line of sustainability. And we know that there's transboundary management issues. We know that there's also national economic dependency on these important fisheries, and that there are really complex international markets and operations. But on the other side, we also know that we have to think about climate change adaptation, also mitigation, and we have these overarching ideas of the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and also in the back of our minds, we're thinking about the Convention on Biodiversity and the 30 by 30 goals that all of our nations are beginning to think about in one way or the other. Next slide. So again, with all this kind of background, the major idea of our DA was not necessarily to create new scientific or biological knowledge, but rather to identify the effects of climate change on the ecosystem state using the social ecological system way of thinking, to create these dynamic feedback loops of human systems, and try to understand then the capacity to respond to these ecosystem changes that we have already observed. So this is another example where, you know, the impacts of climate change, it's here. We're already observing them, and we need very good tools and social ecological modeling tools to understand the capacity to respond to these changes. So the things that we know are very interesting to our stakeholders, that we're also trying to do in this process is to, of course, learn a little bit more about how to actually achieve an international agreement on quota allocation and what that might look like. We're also interested in product innovation, what the companies are thinking about, also their experiences of the shift in species distribution, how to think about inclusion and transparency in decision-making, and especially related to the quota allocation. There's also a lot of discussion in the companies about carbon footprint, circular economy initiatives, and then also general concerns about biodiversity and species interaction. Next slide. So our overarching research questions with this were, can transboundary management solutions be linked to climate change mitigation? Is social and environmental sustainability driven by stewardship or market opportunities in upward leadership? And in terms of adaptation planning, basically what happens if the fish leave, and how might the industry implement 30 by 30? So again, these are highly industrialized and sort of vertically integrated companies, and that creates a really, really interesting case study for us to look at some of these issues related to general ecosystem stewardship and sustainability, but especially under changing climate situations. Next slide. So here's what we've been doing. We have done a lot of background data collection. So for example, we've been going through the company sustainability reports. These companies actually have a lot of data, and we're trying very much to work with the data that's already available. As Gemma mentioned, you know, these behavior over time graphs, These are things that we're trying to collect all kinds of social and economic data, as well as the ecological data that I showed you previously. So we did a very preliminary DIPSR. We've also had a student project who was looking at the overall governance structures and the history of the international agreements between these straddling stocks. And we've done a bit of stakeholder mapping as well. We've developed our own stakeholder protocol with this, where we have in these early phases a target of 40 to 50 individuals between all three nations that we are in contact with. So I have a screenshot of the brochure that we've been sending out, begging for participation. And we've actually had a lot of interest in this project from not just the companies, but also other biologists, economists, sort of academic and other researchers, environmental NGOs, community organizations, interest groups, and also the marketing and innovation side. And I should note as well, one thing that I guess those of us who work in fisheries, we know this, but it's so important to sort of repeat it, is that when we say the fishing industry, I mean, the experiences and opinions can be so varied. So we are talking, of course, with fishing company executives, but also they may have a very different sort of understanding of issues or opinions compared to captains, and they compared to the crew. So we're really trying to look at a big snapshot of the industry as well. Next slide. So here's the stakeholder mapping. These are the kind of folks that we've been talking to. I won't go through all of these, but you will notice that there's some parts of general society or other marine-related industries that we've purposely left out of this because we wanted to focus very much on just the pelagic fishery. So for example, a lot of the inshore small-scale fisheries and things related to marine spatial planning are not really a highlight in this, although of course they're threads that we are still looking into. But these are the major stakeholders that we have been working with. So the ministry, at the local level, sort of harbor masters, and the regional level, association of municipalities. The public audiences that we've been working with are the unions, ENGOs, and then the catching and processing owner associations. Then we have different groups within the fishing industry and private sector as well, and then research and academia in all three countries. And in our stakeholder protocol, we have an open-ended sort of semi-structured interview where we're going through just basic kind of experiences and perceptions about the fisheries and sort of the experience over time and projected worries or concerns for the future. And then we have also a topic ranking in a Likert type scale exercise where we have a list of known topics that are important in one way or another in the pelagic fisheries, and we're asking people to rank exactly how important they are. And I'll show you some data related to that in just a moment. Oh, or now. So this is the very preliminary results from the Iceland side of things. So we have been splitting up by countries, but the idea overall is that we'll also create, a general sort of like, what are the trends we see just within the whole Arctic demonstration area? So one thing that, of course, it's nice to see, but also not surprising, the topic that was ranked sort of the highest, which is the darkest color green there, is inclusion and transparency in political decision making. So that's actually really nice. It's not surprising, but it's good that, our original sort of like, wow, this is really important. And, we really need to research this more. It's also good to hear that, of course, the people in the companies and also in decision making are also ranking this as a basically top priority. But what's also interesting in Iceland is that the basically second most important topic was this carbon footprint reduction, and close after that was biodiversity conservation. So these are the things that are really on people's minds, and it's also interesting to note what's people are considering not so important. So at the bottom there you see noise pollution, and then also cultural heritage and identity and traditions. And this is interesting for me, again, as a social scientist, how in these particular fisheries, this is ranked quite low. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. The next slide, Gemma, is just to show you sort of the variation. This is from the Faroes. So again, people ranking international agreement and on the quota allocation, and also biodiversity conservation and inclusion and transparency in political decision-making as quite important. For the Faroes, we thought it was very interesting. Again, noise pollution is down at the bottom as things that maybe it's not so important, but also spatial management of fisheries. So this idea of, I think a lot of us in fisheries are thinking so much about the spatial management, 30 by 30 goals, and these kinds of things, protected spaces, whatever that might be. But in this fishery, it's maybe just not as important. Or is that just something that we haven't really thought about, how spatial management might be important for some of these very, very widespread straddling stocks? Next slide. So here again is a draft causal loop diagram. So please, for those of you watching, don't take this as we are saying that this is the reality of this system. We are still working on this, and actually the next step is to take this model to our stakeholders. So this has not been verified in the process that I was showing you earlier. This is just sort of like how we've been thinking about things, what the data are telling us in these behavior over time graphs that Gemma showed you. But we're very much working to create a little bit more of the meaning related to this. So on the next slide, I'll give you one example. This is an example of a positive feedback loop. So we can see that there's an increase, if there's an increase in Icelandic workers in the fisheries sector, that this would have a medium strong impact on the pelagic fishing vessels' total days at sea. So that's the total effort in the, what do you call that, turquoise box there. And this would lead to a further increase in fishing vessels' CO2 emissions. And that would lead to a further increase in mackerel occurrence in Icelandic EEZ waters, if we think about the reason for the species shifts. And then this would lead to an increase in Icelandic mackerel catch. And then that would lead to a further increase in the number of jobs in the fishing and processing sector, and ultimately leading to an increase in Icelandic workers in the fisheries sector. So again, this is a theoretical sort of positive feedback loop, meaning that the things impact each other, not necessarily that it's a positive sort of value outcome. And the relationships in this model make sense, except for that we know in reality, it's unknown how many numbers of Icelandic workers in the fishing sector relate to total days at sea, as well as the fishing vessel's CO2 emissions and the mackerel occurrence. So again, we're creating these models and they're helping us understand the system, but we need a lot more sort of like feedback from the stakeholders and potentially a lot more data to really verify what exactly is going on in this and how that might change if one of the nodes changes or decreases or increases, or potentially even drops out of the entire social ecological system model. Next slide. So again, those are very preliminary data. And again, like I said, we're in this stage where we need to go back to the stakeholders. There's a lot more work to be done, but we've also got a lot behind us in terms of mapping what's important to the stakeholders, who should be involved, and some of these relationships in the causal loop diagram. So some interesting feedback in this whole process. Again, I'm working here in Iceland with the Icelandic stakeholders. And our colleagues in the Faroes, Denmark, and Greenland are, working specifically with their stakeholders. But we also see a lot of interaction, of course, between the companies and the countries. So, for example, there's a Faroese captain on a Greenlandic vessel that's maybe landing in Iceland. So, in terms of the social model, or where do we count this person in the stakeholder model, these things can get sort of muddled, but that also shows us that it is a system that is very interconnected and very interesting to study. we're thinking too about how to ensure the transferability of data. So this is both, I mean, just between the countries. So the things that we're finding here in Iceland, does that matter for the Faroes, and does that matter for Greenland? Sort of how do we create one Arctic demonstration area sort of consistency, but also with the other demonstration areas in the project? And then again, long term. So as Gemma said, especially with the social data, these can sometimes be sort of snapshot in time. So how do we ensure that these kinds of data could be interesting for researchers either in the future in our nations or outside of our demonstration area? And then I hinted at this earlier, and I think, again, you can tell I'm a social scientist by the way I was talking about the ecological data before. That's what's so nice, again, about working on these teams of natural and social scientists. But we're really interested in this idea of the community level data. So again, a lot of these ideas with the social ecological systems are very place-based fisheries, and it's very easy to map sort of one community and all the stakeholders within that one, geographic community. We are not necessarily dealing with that, but at the same time, so we know that this is an international fleet not bound to particular coastal communities, but obviously there are people on board these vessels who live in communities, right? And sometimes there are rural communities that maybe do have actually sort of relationships with the pelagic fisheries. So we're trying to, this is something that's kind of, it's a little unclear, and we're trying to figure out how to measure the impact to individual communities and what that might sort of mean for future changes in the fisheries stocks. So for example, in Iceland, many of these companies are based on the east coast, the Ísafjörds of the country, because they're the closest to the fishing grounds. And let's say that the fisheries decrease or increase, what might that mean for very local sort of like impact in these communities? So this one we're still working on. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap it up here, the take-home messages. So the three nations that we are working with for the DA, we catch about 1 million tons per year, which is about 30 to 40% of the annual catch of these three important pelagic stocks. And they are fished above the scientific advice between 20 and 40% since 2010. And this is specifically due to the lack of agreement on the quota sharing. So we know, and it's not surprising, that the preliminary findings confirm the importance of political transparency on top of all of the other issues that these companies are thinking about, energy transitions, other impacts of climate change, sustainable financial reporting, and these kinds of things. But what we're still kind of working with is how exactly this simple socio-ecological system model can aid in governance transformations. So what can we do with this particular model? Maybe it's not necessarily even for the companies, maybe it's more so for the decision makers, so that they can see how the system is interlinked and what potential sort of non-resilient situations might be within that particular model. So again, as I mentioned earlier, our next steps are to test the model with stakeholders, and then we think we'll get really a little bit more of the sort of practical feedback that is needed, both from other academics, the biologists, fisheries managers, mayors, and all of the different kinds of stakeholders. That's our next steps. So the next slide, I think, is the last slide. On behalf of myself and Gemma and also the whole MarineSABRES consortium, I'd like to say thank you so much for your time. Please look us up on social media and LinkedIn. And we're just really excited for the continuation of this project and really hoping for some pretty exciting results as the project continues. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for your attention and your time.
Thank you. Excellent presentations, and so rich, all of the slides with information. I could have spent, I think, 10 minutes just looking at each slide and trying to decipher all of that. content. So thank you very much, Gemma and Catherine. And I think one of the key points which you were also making, and which is also part of what maritime spatial planning is all about, is it has to address the spatial and temporal uncertainties of climate change. And what I'm seeing from what you've developed here is that through this simple SES model that you've created, it would really help us do that. Is what I'm hearing and seeing, because it's the circular loop, it's a feedback loop, it's a causal loop. So it's really dynamic and taking into consideration all of the factors that's going on in the seas, and it's also taking into consideration both compounding and cumulative impacts of all of the multi-use of our seas. So, I mean, extraordinary the work that you've both done, and the greater team that's not here with us right now. So I just want to applaud you both in that. We have so many questions that have come in, and we have technically only 3 minutes because I think we have a hard stop today. So what we'll have to probably do is collate these questions and
let
send
me
them
jump
to
in.
you. Yeah,
There's so
go
many
ahead,
questions.
Jose.
Forget the hard stop. There are so many questions.
Good.
I have 9 questions. Do you have time for a few minutes more, Catherine and Gemma? Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, Valerie.
That's okay, Jose. That's great. So yeah, I can start us off with the questions then. So let's see here. So I've got questions coming in from various different platforms. So I'm going to start with Zoom. We have Gregory Jean-Baptiste that has asked, what is the difference between the DPSIR and the DASPI WRM models? And maybe this is addressed to you, Gemma.
Yeah, of course. So from my understanding of these problem structuring methods, they've evolved throughout time to reflect our understanding of the marine environment and the various facets within it. So I think it started as DPSR and then went to DIPSA, and there's DIPSI and DIPSA and DAPSIWORM. So there's lots of different variations. Whilst we're answering other questions, I'll see if I can find a quick link to the paper to put in the chat. But essentially it's various methods of understanding the multifaceted nature of the marine environment. I believe that the Ocean World Assessments now started using either DIPSA or DAPSIWORM in the thematic assessments as well. So we can see its wide uptake as well throughout.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Then just one other question, I think, for you too, Gemma, is the DAPS WRM applicable in the Caribbean states? Those small island developing states, yeah.
Okay. I can't say I'm very familiar with that, although we have seen the application of the DAPSIWORM in various contexts, so it's quite a adaptable framework. One of the reasons why it was chosen in this context was how it can be applied to different areas. So every area is likely to have drivers which are warranting the activities in the environment that are causing pressures and have state changes. So I think it's likely that it would be applicable. And yeah, I'll put a link into that paper.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, it would make sense since we're humans, all humans, and we have similar, I think, problems in our areas. Okay, moving on. So for Dr. Chambers, fantastic presentation. How similar or different are the challenges in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, namely Patagonia in relation to pelagic fisheries?
Gosh, I'm gonna have to say I don't know much about the Antarctic pelagic fisheries system. I think it would be sort of not right of me to try and guess, except for that, you know, if these are large vessels, I'm guessing there's transboundary issues in the Antarctic as well. And I think you can expect similar sort of like social systems in the idea that these are vertically integrated companies. In terms of the ecological side of things, I really couldn't answer if there's also sort of like moving feeding and spawning grounds of the target species in the Antarctic. I just simply can't answer that, and I apologize.
That's okay, we understand. I think you touch upon something really key, and you've stated it a couple times in the presentation, is that transboundary challenge that is key, and it keeps showing up here, at least in our European seas. We've identified that as one of the biggest challenges that the maritime spatial plans that we have. So transboundary cooperation is critical, and what this model is really highlighting, or what I'm thinking it is highlighting, is the gap, or where it's working, where there is transboundary cooperation, or where it's falling in the gaps. Okay, let's move on to this other question here. So again, great talk. So for you, Dr. Chambers, large oceanic, highly migratory pelagic fish are important for the Caribbean islands fishing fleet. How can we apply the results of the MarineSABRES project in the Caribbean? We lack reliable, robust data in our region, and we have weak regulation frameworks and huge shortage of skilled people. And this touches on something I also wanted to highlight, which it does seem that this is very research intensive, needing the model. So yes, if you could speak to that, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, again, it's a very good point, and I tried to make that throughout the make that point throughout the presentation as well. The reason we can do this model is because we have data, and as Gemma showed, these behavior over time or bot graphs. Maybe it's not perfect. For example, just this idea of number of jobs, we were really like, how do the number of jobs change with the increase or decrease of fisheries? Because it's not necessarily one-to-one. I mean, you can sort of think that it might be, but do you have the data to back that up? And then I think also this idea of, I mean, a lot of what we're doing in these interviews is qualitative work. So how do you take qualitative data and move it into, a graph that needs to show, or a figure that needs to show flows, that needs some kind of quantity behind it? I would say, I think that this sort of, the idea of simple social ecological systems, I think it can be done anywhere. But I think, again, there needs to be maybe some very basic sort of like, what don't we know, work maybe before these types of models are applied. It's similar with just ecological modeling. I mean, you need the background data. And that's, I think we're in kind of a luxury position in that regard with these fisheries. Also because we do have the companies that are willing to, I mean, of course, they're not sharing all of their top secret data with us, but they are very willing to work with us. And these companies, a lot of them are thinking about corporate social responsibility, green financing, energy transitions, these kinds of things. And so we also have this instance where we have an industry who's ready to work with us to be our stakeholders. And I know very much from working in other kinds of fisheries that that's not always the case. So there could be, this classic example where you have the best theoretical sort of like background and the systems thinking, and you're like ready to go with your research questions. But if the background data aren't there and the stakeholders aren't ready to work with you, then it might be a model that can't be applied. And of course, I can't say in the Caribbean or other instances if that's the case, but I think there are things to think about, just like any time you would choose a particular research method for a particular research question.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just thinking of when I was doing value at risk studies, and we were doing also Stella modeling, dynamic modeling. We kind of forecasted. We did different scenarios, so that could be used for this model. I mean, like you said, if you don't have the actual data, you could still use the model with some of the assumptions, using data that you think would maybe be current, or perhaps a past baseline or a future forecasted. Yeah, I'm looking at Gemma too to see if my thinking is correct. Okay, fantastic. So moving on from Colin Smith, thanks for the very compelling presentation. South Africa has 2 small uninhabited sub-Antarctic islands, the Prince Edward Islands. Several pelagic species have been sought in this area. Can we apply the results of your research in this area? Gemma or Catherine?
I'll let you go first, Kat.
Well, I think my answer is unfortunately the same as the first question. I just don't know enough about pelagic species and pelagic fisheries in other nations and areas to be able to answer that. But I mean, again, I think the basic is probably the same. You know, these are non-place-based fisheries, and that's what makes this so interesting. Obviously, it's still a human system. There's still humans on board these vessels. There are humans making decisions. So the basic idea of the social ecological system could be applied, I think.
Yeah, I really agree with that point, as well as that I guess when we look at social ecological systems, they are very context dependent. So when creating this guidance within the project, we tried to provide as specific guidance as possible without making assumptions about an area or what data you are likely to find, because as with all these various different social systems, as well as interacting with very complex and context-based ecological systems, I guess the framework's quite adaptable and was designed for this sort of upscaling, although I guess the conclusions from one area wouldn't directly apply to the other unless tested and proved throughout the process.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. All right, Edna, we're gonna share the slides so you'll be able to see those later. So if you have an actual question about it, go ahead and put that in. Moving on to Chris now. Again, wow, thank you, Catherine and Gemma. How did you start? Was it through academic research or an organizationally identified need? How did you sell the concept to the people that matter? How did you get organizations to participate and support you? Who generates the sources of data and how did you ensure its integrity? Are these 3 species indicative of the overall health of the ecosystem? And how does the research and possible management implementation convert to agreements and mitigate climate change? So lots of questions in there.
I'm going to remember about 30% of those, I think. So the how did we get started? So one of the developers of the Dapsy worm model was connected to us here in Iceland, and so we knew a little bit about that kind of theory and modeling, and then it was decided that we would create this sort of North Atlantic or Arctic demonstration area based on for the SABRES project. Just to sort of note, the other 2 demonstration areas are very much place-based, and for example, one of them is thinking a lot about changes in tourism and tourism as a pressure on marine environments. So that just shows you, you know, there's a wide range of pressures on coastal and marine ecosystems, and we thought a lot about, you know, should we think about whale watching, for example, or other forms of tourism. I mean, in Iceland, we have a lot of tourists, but at some point we had to sort of just say, okay, the most interesting things here are as the things that I've presented in the presentation. For us, it's also the Marine Research Institute of Iceland. They're leading the work here in Iceland and leading the demonstration area. And they have a very good working sort of relationship with the fishing fleet. So they work with logbooks. They have good connection to the fishing fleet. And I understand our partners in the Faroes, Denmark, and Greenland are also, you know, there's good and mostly friendly relationships with the fishing fleet. But of course, we know that that's not always the case. So for us, it seemed like, at least here in Iceland, especially, that the companies were ready to ready to be involved. And same thing with the ministry and other sort of stakeholders, that they viewed this as important. And I think, in the end, it's like I said in the very first slide, this is massively important economically for all three nations. And when you have something that is that important, the research behind it tends to, be supported by the industry. I don't remember any of the other questions now. Maybe Gemma can can pick up on some of the questions that were interesting.
Yeah, of course. I recall the one about generating sources of data and how to ensure this integrity, and if this research is possible in implementation to convert agreements and mitigate climate change. So I can speak very much to the theory of this, and actually within the guidance document with the PIM system, there's a full section which I think really relates to this, as when looking at social and ecological data, this is collected in different ways, and the integrity of this is evaluated in different ways as well. So say if I were doing an experiment in a lab, I may have a p-value for my findings, and that can assert my confidence. Whereas in a social system, I probably won't get that same outcome. So these validation protocols, which is at the stage we're at within this testing, and these process and evaluation outcomes, we think are really important to that, and they're embedded within this PIM system. So that even if our results aren't replicable, because it's unlikely that the Arctic DA's social system is going to match that of the Tuscan Archipelago, but we still have a very well documented and source of our data and our approach, and how we've approached different stakeholders and their various knowledge types in informing our decisions. So within the approach in the guidance document, which I believe might be on the MarineSABRES website, I will have to check with that about how we're disseminating these results. But this should be available from the outputs of the project as well. And then I don't know if you want to speak to how does the research and possible management implementation convert to the agreements and mitigate climate change, Catherine? As this is very specific to the RCDA.
Yes, now I see where I can read the questions, so that's good to have those. Yeah, I think, for us, because this is a model that we're trying to create, and this causal loop diagram, I think that maybe one of the strongest things that we would be able to show is these tipping points in the system that the DIPSR or DAPSI worm framework talks about. So what is the tipping point where there might be a serious economic loss to the companies? And I know that sounds like most of us are, well, this is more important than money and economic loss to highly industrial and capitalized fisheries. But in the end of the day, that's the reason that there are these 20 to 40% overfishing to begin with. So I think, I hope anyway, that we could use this to show, not like a date in time or specific monetary loss, but basically how fragile the system may be, and under future climate change and future environmental changes, the fragility of the system may become more apparent. So I think if there was a way to show that to our stakeholders, and also the people that are really the ones making the decision in the quota allocation agreements, that of course would be the dream.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if we did miss anything, you'll have all the questions in writing, so we can cover them a little bit later. And just, I'm curious, the fragility of systems, did you compare in kind of a time frame what that fragility might look like for these different sectors? So fishing, mining, whatever it can be.
Mm-hmm. Not yet, but maybe we have some time to do that.
Okay, yeah, in that phase 2 or phase 3 that you're looking at next. Okay, great. Then let's see, some more questions here coming in. Imali, I hope I pronounced that right. If you have not considered the small scale fisheries in the stakeholder groups, how accountable are the results here, the ranking, as the way to sustainable fisheries, especially with regards to coastal fisheries, where there is confrontations between industrial fishing and small scale fishing?
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you for that question. Yeah, we have thought a lot about this. In Iceland, there is a lot of, I mean, I think it depends on where you look at in the fisheries system, but there is a lot of, the same people are involved in the small scale fisheries and the larger fisheries. So for example, you may be working on one of the pelagic trawlers and then go on your own small boat for the summertime fisheries or something like that. So as far as we know, there are not a lot of confrontations between the pelagic fleet and the coastal sort of inshore fisheries. They don't occur in the same space. There's not conflict in the harbor. It's not a lot of what is on people's minds at the moment. That's the pelagic fisheries specifically. Now, if we're talking about bottom trawling, that's a different story, and I can't answer that through this work that we've been doing. So again, in terms of the accountability of the results for this particular project, we think they're very good because we've talked to all of the stakeholders that we think, you know, and we've heard from other stakeholders are the ones that are most involved in this. But like I said, we are sort of thinking about what is the connection to the local communities, to rural communities, where some of these boats are landing. And that's something that we will address in the next few months, actually. So again, what you're noticing is a preliminary stage. And if something comes out in the next stages, for example, the key, like if small scale fisheries turns out to be something that we just haven't heard of before, and we do in the next phases, then obviously we would add that into the model, look for data related to those. So this is a flexible sort of process as well.
Gemma, anything else you would like to add? And out of curiosity, you could also go back in time, look at historical records and punch that in, and then maybe forecast, you know, or assume what might happen if a small scale fishery were to return or something of that sort, or marine protected area was allocated there. Because before, let's say, maybe it wasn't fished as much, like say, I don't know, 100 years ago, maybe if we put a marine protected area back in that area, maybe that would impact. Although I don't know, with probably I scratch that actually with all of our multi-use going on now and ever increasing more shipping and all that going on, that probably is out the window. So I take that back. But I see Chris's here question, and we're very much aligned here. Is so he says, I would really value your ideas on how to use this to aid governance transformation. I had a couple of questions on that myself.
Gemma, do you have any thoughts?
I have, I'd say, quite conceptual and theoretical thoughts about this. So there were a lot of intentions when we thought about the different levels of governance when designing this system and how you might identify different points within a system to instigate change. So there's the theory of panarchy, which basically looks at the different levels of governance and whether you want a long and slow change, whether that's targeting consumer behaviors or attitudes towards something, or whether it's that really quick change that you need. So putting an MPA in, stopping all fishing, no catch zones, and so on. So dependent on your scale of system and also dependent on how long over time you've looked at these variables and what that snapshot of your causal loop diagram represents, you may see that in transforming governance measures, you look to them much longer and harder to implement response measures, where you look at, say, consumer behaviours or changes in legislation or along those lines. But yeah, I think Kat might have some more insights on how that is to be applied, although within the project we do have work packages looking at governance and societal behaviour and change in scenarios. So these things are due to be outputs of the project too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are questions that are and research that's still sort of in progress. But one thing I would say that's been really interesting for us so far in these early stages is that the people that we are working with as stakeholders really seem to be ready at their particular levels. So I would say like the companies, for example, really seem to be ready for conversation and sort of they're positive, I guess I would say, that there can be international agreement. It sounds to me like it's really at the very, very high up levels. So it's not company to company. It's very, very sort of national and international where the real sort of decision making seems to break down. And because it is a top-down sort of process, what happens at the top level is the most important, unfortunately, even though a lot of us anyway talk about the importance of bottom-up transitions and, decision making and these kinds of things. But I think one thing I hope is that this shows the willingness of, these companies and others involved to work together. We see the biologists working together, and maybe there's a way to sort of create actually some kind of bottom-up probably slow change, but I think any fast change in the governance would need to be top down. And that's also what's very interesting, this sort of like direction of governance transformations. But yeah, how likely it is. I mean, of course, we hope that our work can solve the problem, but we can just do our best, I think, at the moment anyway.
Yeah, and it's a very useful model at whatever level, local, regional, or national, regional, international, really great for that. And it makes me think of the 1990s Malawi principles of the ecosystem approach to biodiversity management, which I don't know if you remember, number 2 stated that management should be decentralized to the lowest appropriate level. And I kind of think back on that and I think, yeah, I think they were really onto something maybe there. I mean, although I totally agree with you, Catherine, that if you want it to happen fast, it kind of has to come from the top down. But I'm sensing that we're moving into a time now of going from the bottom up, where, I think it's going to be local communities coming in and saying, this is what we're really asking for now, and we're going to maybe enforce it ourselves, monitor it ourselves, govern it ourselves, whatever. So that's just my thoughts. Okay, let's see what time we have. Maybe a few more, but I want to touch in because yeah, it's almost past, and you might have other activities to go to. Is it okay for maybe one last question, or if Jose has one last question, or if I missed anything critical, or okay, maybe I'll have one.
Yes, one last question.
One last question. Okay. And also I want to just give you the floor too, Catherine and Gemma, in case there's anything you feel like you wanted to say that was not covered. And where is that last question that I had in mind? Sorry. Yes, it was really curious because you mentioned that besides noise pollution being way low there, which was a little bit surprising to me, especially when we were talking fisheries, but also that the cultural heritage and identity traditions were low too. I mean, this model obviously takes on board stakeholders, our opinions, beliefs, values. And so that must be a key thing coming into the model is indigenous beliefs and traditions. So I'm not sure where my question lies in this, but do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, and I think I've hinted at this, but just to state, this is the first project I've worked on with such a large scale and international fishery. So my background is very much, place-based fisheries, community fisheries, fishing families and individuals, and that's why this project was so interesting to me, is because we do have international industrialized fisheries that we need to also think about. What does sustainability mean in these fisheries, and what might a social ecological system look like in these fisheries? These models that we use for place-based fisheries should be applicable to international fisheries as well. And if not, what are we missing in terms of future sustainability? Because these fisheries aren't going anywhere, you know? And so I think what you're seeing here, at least in the Icelandic case, is very much this idea of like large boats and large fisheries are modern and industrial, and small fisheries are traditional and local. And obviously that's not the case. You can have large scale fisheries that still are place-based, and you can have small scale fisheries that just started last week and, you know, don't have any sort of local tradition. So I think, you know, it really challenges us to think about this cultural aspect in fisheries. But I think it's also, again, this is reflecting the stakeholders' own opinions. You know, so I can't make them say that, but don't you know fisheries are important? Fisheries are, you know, part of your cultural heritage, especially for me being non-Icelandic born. But I think it reflects the sort of trend in the industry, that, again, this idea of like that which is traditional is somehow in the past, and that which is modern is somehow better and potentially more sustainable. And I think that's very interesting. It has to do with how we define sustainability, you know, if it's economic sustainability, if it's social sustainability, or ecological sustainability. But, you know, I think I probably shouldn't get much into the details of of why this fishery, you know, is considered by the stakeholders anyway as not necessarily related to cultural heritage. But, you know, we do have examples of the herring boom and busts in coastal communities around Iceland, and it's very much part of the history and part of the local identity. But again, also that ranking system was on a scale of 1 to 5 as least important to most important. So not that it's not important, that number 1, just least important. So that's also something to keep in mind there. Gemma, I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
You explained it wonderfully.
Thank you very much. And just, sorry, I'd be cheeky here. So what's next for the MarineSABRES project? You're in phase 2, right? Yeah.
So I am going to head out to some of these communities for exactly this question about local aspects, cultural heritage, connections, fishers' knowledge, experiences of change, and these kinds of things. What we've been doing now is, again, the first phase. So the next phase is to continue on some of these unknowns and these questions with the stakeholders, and producing an updated causal loop diagram. Gemma, maybe you want to say what's next for you?
Yes, so within Work Package 3, we've interrogated lots of social ecological frameworks. We've operationalized and got this one that's been applied. So we're really looking to learn from these experiences and refine this framework, so then we can upscale this further. So within the project, we have Work Package 4 who's testing it. So within these 3 demonstration areas, Work Package 5 who's really looking at how can we apply this to scenarios? How does this, what does this mean for governance and targeted solutions? And then what decision support tools we can get out of this within Work Package 6. So I think there's going to be a lot of outputs from the project over the next few years that will support people in if they want to undertake this project, or not project, but undertake this process and conduct a integrated systems analysis or a simple social ecological system analysis. So MarineSABRES website, I believe, is where you'll find all the information and signposting that you'll need.
Super, thank you. We look forward to that. And if we can help, let us know here. All right, Jose, over to you. Thank you both. You're on mute, Jose.
Again, so sorry. I mean, thank you so much for the presentations. Thank you for Valerie for the very good moderation, you know. And well, we'll keep an eye on MarineSABRES development in the next years. And if you receive any additional questions, we'll forward them to you. Again, thank you very much. Thank you for the audience. Thank you so much. You have a lot of people still there. Half an hour past the hour. So it was a very interesting and interactive session. So thank you. Bye.